hopefully through their stories, they will inspire us to think differently about our own careers and our lives. So without further ado, please allow me to introduce your panelists this morning. Mr. Ashish Kashyap is the founder and former CEO of IBIBO Group. IBIBO is India's largest travel group that owns properties such as goibibo.com and redbus.in. Prior to founding the IBIBO Group, Ashish was the country head of Google India, where he set up the India-facing operations from ground up. And before joining Google, Ashish founded e-commerce and online travel businesses at indiatimes.com and drove them to a profitable and scalable position. Ashish, welcome. Our second panel member is Anu Chitrapu, who is the Senior Vice President and Executive at Bank of America. Anu has won several awards at the bank for exceptional performance and has been named to the High Potential Women Leaders Group. Anu is also on the advisory board of Saheli, an organization that empowers South Asian women, and has served as the gala chair for their fundraiser, Nirbhaya. Earlier this year, along with her two sisters, Anu also launched Nirvana, a social enterprise to save fabric from landfills. Anu holds an MBA from across the river at MIT Sloan School of Management. Welcome, Anu. And our third panel member is Shaun Jayachandran. Shaun is the founder of Crossover Basketball and Scholars Academy, which works towards changing the pathway of low-income marginalized students in India by engaging educators and schools to participate in a program designed to teach leadership, gender equity, and critical thinking. He has given a TEDx, been the chief guest to speak at schools, and has been honored and recognized by the Philadelphia 76ers. Welcome, Shaun. And before we start, I'd sincerely like to thank the panel members for coming in today and sharing their stories and experiences. We'll try and get through as many questions as we can, and I have a few of them for you, but we'd also like to leave time for audience questions at the end. So please go ahead. Okay, so, sorry?
I was saying the lights out.
Okay, here they are. So let's start with some of your early formative experiences, given that we have many students in the room here. Could you tell us about how some of your early educational experiences actually prepared you for your careers and the things that you do today? And relatedly, what are some of the fondest memories that you have as students, particularly in higher education, since that's the setting that we are in?
Okay, so we go with the sequence. Yeah, look, I mean, so one of my learnings from my further education, so I did my post-graduation after working a while. And as a result, I was able to really appreciate the value or intersection between education and practical life. When I went for my post-graduation, I remember solving a real problem for a chain of bookstores in Paris, and another real problem for one of a leading aluminium companies. And I think that was really, really transformational because of application with theory and real practice. So that was, for me, super enlightening.
And what would you say was one of your fondest memories, perhaps, from your time in education when you were?
Yeah, I mean, I've had diverse educations. So I did my economics in Delhi University, and I did my master's in practicing management later on. I think for me, the fondest memories have been these real practical problems being solved, and interacting with diverse people from across the world. And understanding the context of culture. We really take that very lightly, but there is a concept and notion around cultures of countries also like small organizations or large organizations, and again intersecting that with the culture of organizations, which makes things complex. So I think those are some really, really interesting things that I experienced during my education part of my life.
Okay, let's see. So I come from a family of hardcore technologists, I'll put that out there. My father was a leading technologist in the glass industry in India. My brother, my sister both went to IIT, so there was some sort of expectation that I would go into the technology field. And I don't mean expectation from my family, but more from the others outside. So when I expressed disinterest and I said I'm not really interested in technology, people would look and say, but you're smart, why won't you want to? So I would say, wait, so if you're smart, you only have to do technology? And unfortunately, in my time, India is a different place now, but 30 years back, it was a different place. And I kind of felt a pressure, not from the family, but to say, if I don't enter the sciences or technology, then people might think I'm not smart enough. So I chose physics because I did not want to do engineering. I saw my brother and sister and I was like, that is not what I want to do for the rest of my life. And while I enjoyed it, I knew this was not what I wanted to do. And I wanted to get into business. And when you come from a background like that, getting into business is not easy, because the first question people will ask is, what's your experience in business, right? So I had to build that up. So I worked for a few years, and then I went to Sloan to get my MBA. And during the time there, I actually was thankful for my science and math background, because I kind of felt it helped me analyze things better. Not to say that those who didn't have won't handle. I think it's just it's a multi-dimensional thing, right? You need to have analytical skills, you need to have creativity, you need to be able to see beyond what the book is telling you, etc. So it's a mix of skills, and having that analytical thing, it gave me a seat at the table when we were studying in a group, saying, oh, you know what, Anu can analyze and give us this piece. So I do think, irrespective of what your undergrad is, in this country, and I think it's true now in India also, you can do whatever you want in your masters. You can be an MBBS and then go get an MBA and get into a completely, you can go sell something, you can get into advertising. So the world now is a place where shifting is very easy. So one thing I would say to all the students here is, don't think that you're locked into a subject because of what you studied or what you are studying. The world is your oyster and you can do anything you want. And I feel like, I was able to do that. Fondest memory. When I was at Sloan, we went as a group to South Africa. And we went to do entrepreneurship there. So we helped a small entrepreneur in South Africa build out their business plan. And by the way, that company is doing well. So I think the project was successful. But one of the things I did with my teammates is we went to a safari where there were no rules. It was not one of the standard ones. It was a smaller game reserve where we went in a jeep. And we had the most amazing experiences, but one of the things that stood out was there was this leopard, which the jeep we were chasing that leopard, which was really bad, and I didn't want to do it because I kind of felt we were putting pressure on that leopard, but everyone else, they were like, oh, this is the game reserve, and the driver was like, oh, this is what you paid money for, so we are going to go do it. So we went there, and then at one spot, it was getting dark. He said, you can get down now, the leopard is not here, it's sitting in the bush there, so he's watching us, but you can get down, he's not going to come here. And the others with me, they jumped out, and I was like, I don't know whether I want to jump out. So I looked at my other teammates, there were 3 others, and I looked at the leopard, he was in a bush right there, and then I quickly did my analytical thinking and said, if the leopard came out, these 3 were just boasting about how one climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, one does the marathon every year. So out of the 4 of us, I'm the slowest. So you know what my learning is? I'm going to sit in the jeep, you guys go. Enjoy the natural beauty. And that was my learning, is whenever you are in a group, just see where you are. There's no need to show yourself off with that. You have your own skills, they have their own skills. Make sure you're using your best skill in such a situation.
Thank you.
Did the leopard come out?
No, he never came out. He actually just sat there till we left. But he was watching us from the bushes. I could still see him.
So, my experience is a little different. I majored in chemistry. I was born in Canada and finished school in the US. I majored in chemistry and journalism over at George Washington University down in DC. So, like a lot of you, I did my undergrad here in the US. And I think like a lot of people here, we've had expectations from our parents. I majored in chemistry for 2 reasons. One, because my parents really, really, really wanted me to be a doctor, and I think my mom still does. And 2 was the fact that in chemistry, I got to blow things up. Like, you get to go, you get to blow up gummy bears, you get to make alcohol, you get to purify caffeine. Like, that all sounded really exciting, and it was something cool for me to do. But I got very lucky in that I didn't want to go to medical school right after university, and so kind of played around with what I wanted to do, and I went and began teaching at a boarding school as an experience, and fell in love with the concept that I get to educate students, and I get to go and coach, and I get to teach and mentor, and that became a game changer of an experience for me, and I kept pursuing that, which kept leading my mom to ask me when I was going back to school. And so for me, that educational experience shifted when I did go back and get a master's in ed, and my master's was in educational leadership. So it wasn't in a subject area, it was like how to critical think and how to create schools. And that was, for me, a huge transformational educational experience, because I was the youngest in my program. A lot of people were 15, 20 years removed at that time from school. I was about 4. But it allowed me an opportunity to start to play the critical thinker. Again, a different piece for me is that education background. My story is very unique in that my mom was born and raised in an orphanage in India. And so she was an orphan girl child. And somebody 40 years ago really changed my life's family by scholarshiping her to go to high school and then to go to college. Right? And so as I grew older, I started to reflect on those stories. And so for me, you could see how one generation removed an entire lifestyle changes. So as I was putting together all these concepts and theories, and I was watching the sport I love, basketball, grow into India and try and capture a marketplace in the top 5% of money earners, for me, I saw an opportunity where we could create some impact and change. So when we started Crossover, it was the idea of creating a curriculum that kids can learn through play. And instead of, for me, the term is, instead of punishing a very poor or marginalized kid by saying you have to study more, you have to have extra tuition, here's an iPad, and stuff that doesn't necessarily always reflect from one day to the next, we created this platform where we were teaching real-time critical thinking skills and leadership and gender equity skills, but through the lens of play. And basketball is perfect in India because with population density, it doesn't require much space. And number 2, forgive my term here, but in India, everyone equally sucks at basketball. And so, and I say that because in most sports, it's very easy for boys to exclude girls. And in this case, they couldn't. They were all starting. It's one of the few places you can find in the world, again, where boys and girls can start on equal footing. And so by teaching a sport that isn't actually popular and isn't commonly played, the girls couldn't be excluded. And in fact, they picked up on it really quick, and the boys automatically allowed space for them to be there. And so it became a very accepted place. So, but my favorite educational moment, I think Nina kind of touched on it a little earlier today, is for me, I was in middle school, we had a black teacher from South Africa who happened to be a history teacher at the school, and he was talking about immigration. And it was the first time someone spoke, he called me out and he spoke about the validation of why my family was there in Canada, and that there's a need, and that, you know, my parents filled a role and they immigrated with a purpose. And it was the first time a educator had actually validated why a brown person was in the room. And it really was transformational to hear that as a 13-year-old, to have somebody not just mentoring you and educating you, but actually vouching for why you're there and giving reasons. So for me, that's always like, we should always be trying to do that for the next people too.
Thank you. And I think that leads well into my next question here, which is really about the importance of taking risks and failure. There's been several celebrities who've been giving commencement speeches across the United States lately, talking about the importance of failure. And in fact, Ashish, in one of your interviews, I read that one of your pet peeves is people who are afraid of failure. And your life itself reflects that. You became an entrepreneur at a time when entrepreneurship really was not a thing to do in India, unlike it is now. Shaun, in one of your blog pieces, you wrote about the importance of aggressive mistakes, as you call them. So my question spins off of that. What are some of the biggest risks that you feel you have taken in your own careers and lives? And relatedly, what are some of the mistakes that you made that you really felt like you learned from?
So I worked for Google at a time when entrepreneurship hadn't really taken off. I was the first country manager. It was a big job because Google had become a giant. I would come to the Silicon Valley very often. That exposed me to the whole concept of creation. A lot of Indian people were used to working under the umbrella of a multinational. It was the stereotype that, you know, if you work for a multinational, you're a successful person. And I would actually come here and I would realize that that whole creator economy, which has made this country what it is kind of missing. And as a result, that got me to start IBIBO. And in fact, I started that on day one as an incubator fund. When people didn't understand what is a fund, there was hardly any venture environment. I, of course, pivoted that to a organization and an operating organization. But I think in general, if I wouldn't have taken that plunge, it would have been very hard. And what I feel really good, because we recently exited. We exited with very good returns to the people who showed faith in us. Besides this, 100 to 200 people who worked for me created value, and they'll become entrepreneurs. So that propelling system was needed. To your question, I think during this journey, I saw obviously more failures than successes. So if today's date, we talk a lot about successes. We talk about the Facebook stories, we talk about the WhatsApp stories, but we don't really talk about failures. And there's obviously lots to learn. As you know, failure rates are as high as 95% to 97%. And you learn from that and you course correct. So during my journey, obviously I saw a lot of that. And each failure taught me so much and gave me so much of data points. It was just that I think the one thing that I started doing better over the course of period was that the cost of that failure should get reduced. So, your school fee should just reduce. So you should start killing fast, because you don't want to really hit your head against the wall. You don't want to swim against the tide. You want to really go with the flow. So I think that was the learning. But I think every failure we would celebrate. And we would obviously celebrate successes, but failures even more so.
Sure. Yeah, that term aggressive mistake is something I use a lot, and I use it a lot in the classroom as well. And by an aggressive mistake, I always speak to my students about how there are two types of mistakes. There's the passive mistake and an aggressive mistake. The passive mistake is being too afraid to try, too afraid to start. So I don't know the answer, I'm going to leave it blank, I'm going to move on. And that happens both there, that happens, I don't know how to react to a situation, so I stay quiet. I don't know what's happening on the basketball court, so I just hold the ball. I push them to make the term aggressive mistakes, because for me, you don't know where you're going until you start. And so whether it's a blank piece of paper, just start putting down what you know. And you're smart enough, start figuring stuff out. If you're in a situation, speak what's your truth. And on a basketball court, trust what you've learned and try and do it. And I celebrate those aggressive mistakes, because you may not get it right, but when you're aggressive and you're putting your best foot forward, it gives us a roadmap to how to course correct. I can't help a student, and I don't think we can help ourselves, if you're passive and you sit there, because you have nothing to reflect upon other than that blank slate. But if you've gone through and you've made a process of attempting, having rationale, creating a situation, using critical thinking, even if the situation doesn't go your way, we can look back on it. As an educator, I can look at your test and say, okay, right here, I can pinpoint where you were a little off, and we can make sure that tweak. If it's on the court, it's the same idea. Hey, look, you tried this, but I can now look at your film and say, hey, there's a piece right here that you couldn't see. And so by making mistakes, I encourage my students often. I want to see, I mean, I clearly don't want you to make mistakes, but if you are, let's make them aggressively. And I've done that, I feel like 1,000 times in creating crossover in that same realm. As a lot of you can think, try going to your family and your parents and saying, hey, I'm going to start an NGO that focuses on basketball in India or sports, and the look of terror that you get from thousands of people. But then you are blessed where, you can figure out, you can make tweaks. I mean, again, one of my blessings in life is that Anu actually lives down the street from me, happened to be in Chennai at the same time as our first session, and said, oh, I'll come speak to your students. And all of a sudden I had my first guest speaker walks in, who's impressive and is able to convey and share, but that doesn't happen if I'm not putting myself out there and trying something new.
Okay, so first of all, it was an honor to speak to those children. Failure, I do have little failures all the time, so I don't want to go through that. I feel it's like you said, right? Failure is a way of life, and then each lesson teaches you next time the failure should be smaller and smaller. But the risk taking, I do want to tell a little story of a very big risk I took at work. In fact, it was one where I thought a lot about whether it was the right time for me to take the risk. I am a big proponent of diversity and inclusion in corporate America, especially at the senior levels of management, because first of all, even the women representation in that high senior level of management is low, and people of color women is even lower, as we know. There are statistics that prove that when the board composition is 50% or more of women, the company actually does better. This is not, we are beyond the debate stage. All the statistics and numbers prove that. You can call any data scientist and he'll say, yes, this is a documented fact. But still, right, the numbers are not there. So at large corporations, they actually measure all of these. So as a good manager or as a good executive, you are supposed to have a certain composition of diversity on your team of senior managers. So what I realized is that the person who at that time was the executive higher than me, he had 2 women on his team, me and another person. The other woman was also a person of color. She was from here. And so he looked great on the metrics. So, the scorecard that showed him, it was like, wow, he has like 3 men and 2 women, and both women are people of color. One is of Indian origin, one is here, Black American. I mean, what can be better than this guy as a proponent of diversity? But what I found in all the meetings is whenever we had to make some serious decisions, it was always the 3 other men whose word he would listen to. And sometimes there were these meetings where, as a senior member of his team, I have to have a seat at the table, but he would be calling them, get their opinion beforehand. So I wanted to speak up, and I actually spoke to the other woman and said, do you also feel it? Because I don't want to be oversensitive to these kind of things. She also felt it. And then there was one day where it was clear that, I don't know what it was against me, but he just won't listen to what I said, and I felt I was right. So I decided I would speak up. I spoke up to him and I said, I think you're not listening to our voices, because I do think what you are doing is not the right direction for the company. I'm not thinking of it from me or from my team, but as a company, this is not a good idea. And 2 days later, he announced a reorg, and he put me under one of the men on the team and said, you know what, I'm doing a reorg because my focus is now not on what you are doing, but that's still important, so I want to place you under him because now he's going to have all this responsibility. So I came back home and I told my husband, I said, this is very wrong because I spoke up and this is what he did, and I really want to take this up. But it was a very risky time for me because my husband was doing a startup and we were all really dependent on my having a job and like health insurance and all the usual things that go on. But My husband said, you know what, if you really feel this is wrong, you should speak up, because if you don't, you'll get into the habit of not speaking up. So I went to HR and I said, so here are my reviews from the last year. I've had exceeds performance throughout. I have many people in the company at many senior levels who I can go and talk to and they will support me. I had the company's best interest in mind and he's pushed me down. So what do I do about this? Do you think it's fair? And they said, well, you know, these are circumstances which happen. It's not that he has anything against you. I said, no, I'm not even saying this against him. I'm just asking about me. Is it fair? And 2 days later, there was another announcement. And they said, Anu is back up on the senior leadership team because the company focus has changed. So I was happy to be back, but I said that was not the right message you gave, that the company focus had changed. It had never changed. It was just because I spoke up, and I want more women to have this voice. So it was a big risk I took. In fact, I put my job at risk at a time which was not good for the family, but I'm really glad I did it, because even now, this incident happened many years back, but even now there are people at my workplace who come up to me and say, you know what, after you did that, I called HR. I said, no more of sitting down and being quiet. I don't care. If you fire me from the job, I'll find another one, but I'm going to take the risk. So that's my risk story.
Fantastic. Thank you. We're going to switch gears a little bit. I'd like to get your perception, and there are 3 entrepreneurs here on the panel, and potential entrepreneurs out there in the audience. So how do you think the ecosystem for entrepreneurship in India has evolved over the last few years, and where do you see it going into the future?
Yeah, I think a lot of change since I started, because there wasn't any venture ecosystem which was there if you go back 10 years. So now we do see that there is a lot of venture ecosystem. And I'll also tell you what the issues are, which you all should be kind of watchful. It's a great opportunity, by the way. But I think the pieces of the puzzle are coming together. If you go back in time, one of the things which really was bad for a country like ours, and I hope there aren't any related parties here, was this whole tech services business. I mean, I think it crushed innovation completely, because the whole business model was predicated on arbitrage, which means that the cost of people is lower in India. So why don't we have these thousands and thousands of people work out of India to reduce our cost structures and hence improve our margins, which is what propelled companies like Infosys, etc. It was great for the job economy, but for the longer term, a country does really well through innovation. So it completely killed innovation. Now with that arbitrage coming down, and with young people beginning to see early days of success, with ecosystems, with venture ecosystems coming in, and with some of the local domestic companies which are becoming scaled, because at the end of the day there's supposed to be a food chain. I think it's changing. It's definitely changing. Having said that, we still need to move to this whole notion of what's working in US. Let's copy that model. So if you see, the tens of billions of dollars which have gone into funding, unfortunately has gone into business models which look like that of an Amazon or an Uber. These are global network effects of global platforms. It will always be hard. I mean, at the end of the day, Google will pay to his best engineer, or Amazon will pay to his or her best engineer close to $7 to $8 million. Those cost structures won't hold good. So the point I'm trying to say is that while it's changing, but there needs to be thought around local innovation, whether it is in the field of education or finance or health, basically at the very basics of Maslow's. There are too many imperfections, too many problems. And I think now all of you, if you are thinking of building ventures out of India, should be thinking of absolute local problems. So that's really what I would like to say. And I think that's just very, very early days. It's just beginning to happen, but still not very significant. And to some extent, the venture environment is to be blamed, because if a kid were to get up and say, look, I want to solve this problem of energy and toilets, right, in India, for example, the second question that would be asked is, has this worked anywhere else in the world? And you wouldn't get a parallel. And if you won't get a parallel, you won't get capital. And you won't get capital, you won't get going. So I think that needs to change, and it's changing. Hopefully now the next phase, we should be working towards it.
Okay, so I don't have any direct entrepreneurship experience in India. It's good to hear about the environment. My experience is all through social entrepreneurship. And the one thing I will say, which has been very heartening the last few years that I've gone back to India, I went and worked on flood relief operations during the flood in Chennai 2 years back. And I was just amazed at how the next generation, how they really care about social issues, the way they came out and just helped with the operations. And many of them actually are working towards social entrepreneurship. I find that people are more acceptable of social entrepreneurship in India now. So before, if you'd say I have this idea of doing X and X, I may not get any income, but I may earn a decent income. Parents, family, friends, they would be like, okay, that's all on the side, but what is your main job going to be? Like, what is going to put bread on the table? First figure that out, and then you can do all this, what they call social service in India. But the environment has changed a lot now. In fact, I find parents of my generation actually talking very proudly about their kids who've gone into social entrepreneurship. And the kids also, your generation, the ones who are educated, they can go to a Goldman Sachs or McKinsey and go follow the traditional path, but they are doing all these non-traditional things and doing it with pride. That is a big change. Also think social media has really helped in the area of social entrepreneurship, because now any woman sitting at home can do a startup. And with my own social entrepreneurship, that's what I found. I've been able to get in touch with women who are looking for a job with just a phone, with WhatsApp, and we are actually able to come up with business models.
I think, so Crossover's worked in India since 2012. We started the concept a few years earlier, but I think the biggest thing you're starting to see is that accepting, but also that first wave of massive tech change has kind of hit India. And again, my rough numbers is probably like the top 40% have access to that. And when I say access, I'm talking like access to consistent internet, social media, data, and purchase power. So I think the environment's becoming much more welcoming, and hopefully and that's going to open up more doors, especially as internet data becomes more available, especially as smartphone costs drive down in India. Just a simple one, and I think that exchange of information is huge. But for us, a practical example is when Crossover was getting going, we have 400 to 500 students every year in our program, which meant we needed about 500 basketballs to have for our scholars. The first few years, we couldn't find a place in India to source, say, 500 basketballs at one time, which sounds a little ridiculous, to be honest, but it's an actual issue we face. So I was contacting people here in the US, connections of mine, we were deflating 500 basketballs, putting 35 in a suitcase at a time, and smuggling 500 basketballs into India, of all things you could possibly imagine. But the airlines were okay with that because they don't weigh anything. And but we were bringing them in. And in the last 2 years, we've actually been able to now locally source that, right? Which is something that's important, is to create economies, not just for yourself, but also in the local environment. I think you were touching on that, which is it's not just your growth, but how do you impact those around you? And I think that's where we're starting to see India have more opportunities and more social impact. The CSR laws that have gone into place in the last 2 years is starting to have an effect, and as people clean up that idea, that's also a game changer, is that